right now we have one of the sessions that I'm most excited about, which is our copycat legislation session. How many of you have reported on copycat legislation or model bills? Okay. How many know about it? Okay, good. So as I was saying to our presenters, you are just the perfect audience for them. They're excited, I'm excited. So our presenters today are Kristian Hernandez, who is a reporter for Pew Stateline, but before that, worked with Preethak Rebala at the Center for Public Integrity. He is a news developer and he is still there. Michael Squires also worked on the project that kind of started this all, which was Copy Paste Legislate. He's now the Southwest editor at ProPublica. We were just kind of joking because Copy Paste Legislate was a really huge project, and it won the Goldsmith Award. It was really well recognized. It also had a lot of people on it. I was actually one of those people because I was doing social media for it at the time at USA Today. And Samia, you were also on it. So it was a big team, big project, but it also had a big, far reach and still has implications. So with that, I'm going to let you all kick it off. Well, Michael will kick it off he's in Arizona, and we'll get started. And then we'll have lots of time for you all to ask questions about your own states.
Thank you, Anne. I think Kristian, Preethak, and I are especially happy to be talking about this because kind of when this project started getting some attention is right at the onset of the pandemic. So we never really had a chance to get together, even virtually, to kind of celebrate winning some hardware and to discuss, what we think some important journalism. Anne mentioned this a bit, but we have, I think, 90 minutes for the session, and we've been asked to leave about half that time for questions. So if a question occurs to you while any of us are talking, just jot it down, and we will hopefully have time for any question that comes up. So to give you a bit of an outline, I'm going to talk about how I came up with this idea and why I pursued it, how I developed it with my team, and then and with the team at the Center for Public Integrity, and then how our work shaped how we think about model bills and what's behind them, and really how we think about influence in state houses and how it's wielded. And Kristian's going to talk about how to choose models to report on and how to go about doing that. He's done more of the shoe leather on this than anybody on the panel for sure. Preethak is going to explain the tool that he developed at CPI and give a demo and offer some tips on how to use that. So that's some good real-time help for you in doing this work. I think we can kind of go to that. We can go to that first slide if you want. So I ran state house teams for many years, and one of the themes that I was always interested in, or one of the primary goals I had in covering a legislature, is to understand influence. So if you think about it in its most like civics class kind of way, people elect a representative. The representative goes to the state house, and simply put, whose bidding do they do once they get there, and why are they doing that? Like trying to understand, why does a legislature do what it does? Like I'm in Arizona, as Anne mentioned, and this year, according to the last count I saw, the lawmakers here had introduced more than 70 bills having to do with elections, having to do with voting. I think we know what the motivations are behind that. It's a Republican-controlled legislature, but you get the idea. In a state where, just as easily the cost of living is exploding in Phoenix and Arizona, we're experiencing a drought that's gone on for 2 decades that is an existential threat. It's climate change is predicted to be a huge disruptor of life here. So there are plenty of problems, but which ones do they try to solve, or or are they offering ideas that really have nothing to do with the problems that the public's concerned about? So I find tremendous utility in that. I think it explains a lot about the quality of representation you get, and whose problems they're concerned with. And one thing I encountered as I started asking, or as I've asked reporters about what they cover or why they don't write about certain things, is I'll often get the response, well, everybody knows that they're doing this or that, or everybody knows that they have to do the bidding of this industry or that industry, or this huge donor or that huge donor. And I'll often tell them, like, I'm your editor. I'm, somewhat, intelligent person. If I don't know that, then your readers certainly don't. So I think sometimes you can kind of get, it's like the frog in the boiling pot. Once you get accustomed to your surroundings, talking to all the insiders, talking to lobbyists, talking to lawmakers, and you can kind of forget some of the things that you take for granted as far as understanding why things work the way they do is something that your readers understand, and that's often not the case. So, if you hear yourself saying that, well, everybody knows this, I would think about that, whether that's really the case. So let's talk about how model legislation fits in that. We can go to the next slide. I think just to kind of give the general definition, a model bill or copycat legislation would be legislation that's written by, somebody that with the intent to have it replicated in, various state houses. It's been around a long time. ALEC is certainly well known, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And, going back to like Trayvon Martin, it kind of became a focus then, because the reason George Zimmerman was not charged in the killing, or initially in the killing of Trayvon Martin, it was because of a model bill known as the Stand Your Ground Law. And that bill had been written in one state, but then ALEC had taken that and distributed it. So, and then to add to that, just because something is a model bill doesn't necessarily make it bad. Going back decades, like the seatbelt laws that are pretty uniform across the country, that was a model bill. There are model bills to distribute medicines to counteract opioid overdoses. And I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. But the things that we focus on is where someone's having undue influence, where there's a special interest taking control of the process, right? Just like you would if you're looking at any other kind of interest that's having undue influence in your state house. And I kind of have to give a shout out a bit. Certainly we did not discover this, like I said. Others had done this at the University of Chicago. A data scientist named Joe Walsh ran what was known as the Center for Data Science and Public Policy. And he had figured out there was a way to use algorithms to, which, we would kind of compare them. I think everyday people would say that's like, detecting plagiarism. But to do that, to see where text had been copied from one bill to another. And here in Arizona, the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting had done a 2016 project on that I was aware of. And they gave a presentation at an IRE session that year. And, it occurred to me that, like, if you could, like, that was interesting. But to me, it did not show, like, the entire suite of what was going on. Like, if you showed, this is a model bill here and that's a model bill there. Yeah, that's interesting. But what if you could show how prevalent it was, who was using it to manipulate the system, to benefit themselves instead of necessarily do the will of the voters, then I think you would have really shown something, right? So what were the questions? Like I said, who's writing them? Why are they writing them? What are they getting out of it? How do lawmakers get these bills in their hands? Why are they so eager to carry the water of someone who wants them to carry their model bill? So those are some of the questions we had at the outset. And by the time we were drafting kind of what we call the first story that we wrote on it, I came up with that sentence that you see highlighted there. It occurred to me that copycat bills amount to the nation's largest unreported special interest campaign. They're driving agendas in every state house and touching nearly every area of public policy. Now, how can I claim that? Well, here was my thinking. If I have a lawmaker and they have contact with a lobbyist buys them dinner, takes them on a trip, or some group takes them on a trip, at some point that gets reported. If we have a powerful industry that wants laws passed for their benefit and they make campaign donations, somehow that gets reported. But when a copycat bill changes hands, almost without exception, there is no reporting of that. There's no documenting when that happens or who's behind it or what they want. But that is influence in probably its purest form. I mean, you are literally trying to write a law. So the approach was sort of to try to dust for fingerprints, right? Let's see whose fingerprints are on the legislation around the country, who's having success doing this. And that how massive an undertaking that would be, I had no idea. I was completely naive, and which is probably a good thing. Otherwise, and Preethak can certainly attest to this, but otherwise you probably wouldn't have taken it on. So we can go to the next slide. I'll just talk a bit about like what our approach was. So how did we do it? Preethak, they had a slightly different approach, but like generally we were trying to do the same thing. So we wanted to take a good chunk of we had about 10 years of legislation that we pulled onto our servers. And like, how are we going to go look for it? What we found was the best method would be to find existing model bills that we knew about, and through sourcing and through just looking around, ALEC, for example, they will put a lot of their bills just on their website. They're not hiding them. They're just out in the open. Some you can kind of find by seeing these matches. So we found more than 2,000 of them to compare to these 1 million bills that had been introduced. And this built, and then we had keywords attached to them. So if there were keyword matches, then the model bill would be compared to the legislation, and you could compare the text. Once we had that, then we had to figure out a way. So how do you determine what's been copied or what's not? What we arrived on was developing an algorithm that determined like how many text strings. So if you have like 5 words that are identical from one bill and another, well, how many times does that occur? And then in 6 word strings, and 7 and 8 and 9, 10, and so forth. And based on that, we've developed a score. And so we had like a 1 to 100 scale. And we were very conservative. We didn't, we said we found 10,000 bills that were copied. It probably double that, but we wanted to err on the side of caution. And so we would only take anything with a score of 80 and above. We think that's a lot of similar words there. It also talks about other things, like who was writing them. Most of them were from, industry, almost half. A similar number were conservative. They had to do with conservative groups, and a slightly lesser share were from liberal groups, and then just kind of others. But if you get to the model bill, I don't know if you're scrolling through that, you can see it shows the percentage of words that are copied from this. It's called the American Laws for American Courts. More colloquially, they're called anti-Sharia law bills. It's a solution looking for a problem. I mean, Sharia law is not a thing in American courts, but there are some groups who think it's to their advantage to, that this appeals to their base. And so one of them is Frank Gaffney. If you've been following the Jenny Thomas coverage recently, he works closely with Jenny Thomas and her group. But anyway, They go around with these, but you can see the copy, the Kansas 2012, and there's an Idaho bill. You can see just some of the phrases lifted. So that's what we found. We found at least 10,000 that had been substantially copied from model bills. So I guess we can go to the next slide. So who's behind them? As I mentioned, ALEC is one of them. Industry groups. One of the bills that we spent a lot of time covering was backed by an industry group that has asbestos liability. So people obviously get mesothelioma, form of lung cancer. There's tremendous liability associated with that. They had a bill that is called the Asbestos Transparency Bill. Like, I mean, who could be against transparency, right? Well, when you looked at it, what it did was it made it take longer for people to get settlements for their asbestos-related illnesses. Most people, once they're diagnosed with mesothelioma, die within a year. And so if it takes a year to get through that process, their bill has gone down because, then the impact, the person's no longer alive. You're not paying for medical treatment. You're just compensating the family for death. And in the case of that bill, the industry paid an expert to fly around the country and testify at hearings. Other people we found involved with this are places that like to be known as think tanks. I put scare quotes around that because they're really activist groups. Here in Arizona, the Goldwater Institute is one. And if you want to find out who is likely doing this, the State Policy Network has affiliates in every state, and this is one of their favorite things to do. I'll talk a bit about the Goldwater Institute and one of their successful, they probably have the most successful model bill of all time, called the Right to Try, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And then public interest law firms. Again, I'm in Arizona, so I keep using Arizona examples, but the Alliance Defending Freedom, you've probably heard of the so-called bathroom bills. That's where those originated. They call themselves a public interest law firm. They pursue, kind of these culture war things. I think they are involved in some of the transgender sports bills. Anyway, so if you start seeing these things, they're immediately some likely candidates for where they're coming from. So, why are they doing this? I think you can kind of figure it out. Like there's, a financial benefit in some cases to industry or individual companies. Excuse me. One that stories that CPI did was about used car dealers trying to not be held liable if they didn't have recalls taken care of on used cars. So you would end up with bad airbags and people dying because bad airbags hadn't been swapped out in cars that they sold. And then ideological benefits. So, the public interest, like Alliance Defending Freedom, they have an ideology, anti-abortion groups, the heartbeat bills of a couple of years ago. Those were, if not copied, at least inspired, more than a dozen bills around the country that all popped up within a few months of each other. They're obviously motivated by their opposition to abortion. And then, donations. These groups, these nonprofit groups thrive on publicity and people knowing about them and what they're doing. I mentioned Goldwater. They came up with the Right to Try bill. So this is, it's sort of cast as this, let's take on the FDA and their overly onerous requirements to get treatments approved. Honestly, like those have been available since the early 70s. And yet that didn't really stand in the way. I mean, the legislation essentially did nothing. And when we went to Goldwater and asked them, well, how many patients do you know of who have been treated because of your bill? They could only point to a couple of people. and yet it was passed in more than 40 states. It became federal legislation. Trump talked about it in the State of the Union address. So, yeah, it's like I said, it's probably the most successful piece of model legislation ever written. And Goldwater certainly pointed that out when it was asking for donations. The Goldwater Active this year, they they wrote a model about teachers being required to post their lesson plans online. So these groups are continuing their work. Let's go to the next slide. So, what do legislators get? Well, many states have part-time legislatures. They don't have much staff. Lawmakers are often, in my state and many states, that's a part-time job. They don't know how to write a bill, but they want to do something. They want to be able to point to something when they run for re-election. And so what does a model bill give them? It gives them something they can do. It gives them something they can introduce. It's ready-made. You don't have to have a staff do it. It's easy. It may come with an expert. If it's a certain group, they'll, if they're pushing their agenda, they're more than happy to pay someone's airfare out to testify. Very often, it's ideologically aligned with these lawmakers. It's something that they want to do anyway. That's something they agree with at least. Also, it gives them kind of entree into a world of political donors. Debbie Lesko is a member of Congress from here in the Phoenix area, and she was a member of ALEC, and that's what at the ALEC conferences she talked about how valuable it was to be able to go around and meet people. When people go to the ALEC conference, they pay their way, they feed them well. They have speakers come in. Newt Gingrich spoke one year. Betsy DeVos was the speaker, kind of the keynote one of the years we went and covered it. So for a state lawmaker, that's, pretty heady stuff. And they get to take their families along. They can turn it into a vacation. And then sometimes the lawmakers aren't even aware. We found one Pennsylvania lawmaker who was a sponsor or co-sponsor of 70 model bills, claimed that he was unaware that he had done that. Anyway, so, but that shows sort of the power of it. These things get in the bloodstream, they're moving around. If someone picks it up and says, oh, this is going to do something I want to do, then, you've got your influence entering the system without any effort on your part. So let's go to that. This is my last slide. I guess my last point would be, this game is still going. I guess in some ways it's a little disappointing that we didn't have more impact. A couple of states, I think, considered requiring lawmakers to identify who had actually written the language in their bills as a result of our work. But it's still going on, and I put a clip from this Mother Jones story because as all of the election bills were cropping up, this recording was leaked. If you've not read this story, I encourage you to go do it. And here's some of the Heritage Act. So the Heritage Foundation claims to be a think tank, but it's kind of like the Goldwater Institute. It's there's definitely an activist bent to it, and Heritage Action is their political action arm. And a member that was talking about how they had written some of these election voting related bills that you were seeing cropping up around the country and, kind of giving away the game. So that's my advice. If you see similar ideas coming up in different places, I'm sure you follow coverage as part of your work. It's probably not a coincidence. There's probably a common point of origin. Sometimes that's very obvious. Sometimes it's not. In the case of protecting the liability of used car salesmen, that's not going to be obvious. In the case of carrying the water for the election deniers, that's more obvious. But if you find the point of origin and you reveal the motives, there's power in doing that. There's accountability. People who are trying to hide behind things are forced to step out and say, I'm trying to do this and this is why. and I think that makes for a better process. So I'll wrap there and hand off to Kristian. He can talk a little bit about how he goes about reporting these kinds of stories.
So thank you. Kind of laid the groundwork. I think a lot of what we spent at the beginning was, trying to identify what model legislation was, and that was conversations that we had within, our newsrooms, and as we were doing the reporting, kind of finding these examples, we're pivoting and targeting specific stories. Honestly, I think that we could have done 100 of these, but we were trying to show how to find them, what they were doing, and there were specific examples that we thought spread across all of the states. So there's bills that have been introduced for decades that originated in certain places, and we were trying to, at least Preethak and I, when we were developing the tool, because I was a reporter sort of giving some working behind the scenes on the back end of this tracker, and trying to understand, well, how would a reporter use this tool? And we had to do things manually at first. So what I found, being from Texas, a lot of Christian nationalist groups and mega churches, and there's a lot of concern about what influence they have in the legislature, and I was interested in looking at, well, how far their impact went. In Texas, it's whoever works here, you know that these bills exist. They're the bills that allow prayer in schools, that in God We Trust bills, that in public buildings, bills that define marriage between a man and a woman. These bills had existed for a long time in Texas and in a lot of other conservative states. So I started tracking the origins of these bills, and it led me to a very specific place. How many of y'all have heard of Project Blitz? I mean, these guys are not trying to hide it. It was in plain sight. We talk about uncovering who's behind these bills. Maybe after a week or so of identifying the most copy-pasted bills, we found the playbook just posted online. Pray USA, you have an actual playbook. They call this playbook Project Blitz. And it was looking at religious freedom bills, and we found a lot of the bills that we were tracking in there, like actual copies of them, and not just copies, but also talking points, how to present these bills, how to get them passed, like lessons learned from other legislatures where they either took it too far, didn't take it far enough. They're just like, okay, well, we passed this one here, and the next state you could take it a little bit further, and it was amazing. I mean, when we started, we had to do a lot of this manually, so looking at the phrases that we could, plug into Legiscan to look for other bills, or to do Google searches or RSS feeds on these bills. We found 500 bills in 49 states in the past decade, and they didn't have a huge success rate. About 60 of them had been signed into law. I think in the second version of the playbook, that went up to about 25%, I believe. But they didn't have a lot of success rate, but that was why it was called Project Blitz, because the purpose of this was to flood the legislatures with these bills. And that's what they were doing, and they were doing it out in the open. And then the groups that were doing this put their name on the front of this thing. So it wasn't really like, okay, I'm an investigative reporter, I'm gonna go hang out in Capitol chasing around lobbyists to try. It wasn't like that. It was there. It was on the front of the thing called Project Blitz. So it gave us a unique opportunity to see both the spread and the extent that these groups have in state houses. So if you guys go to the story that's on USA Today or at CPI, we published the whole list of all of the 500 bills, and they have links to them, and we categorized them according to how they were categorized in the playbook. So you guys could, trace, if you see some new ones, you could trace it back, like this is the first one that appeared in this state house. And so we published that for y'all, and it was really, that work was for y'all. We had all of you in mind when we were doing this. We were trying to find a way to recreate what we were doing with the resources that we had at CPI, because I've worked at daily newspapers and publications, and I know that you can't spend weeks, trying to figure out influencers and who's pulling the strings. It's more of like you're trying to get the story out before, the end of the day. So we had that in mind when we were working, and we worked that way, and also, put the data out there for that reason in the way that we did. But let me talk a little bit more about these bills. The National Prayer Caucus is the main lobbyist group or organization behind a lot of these bills. And they were founded in 2005 by Representative Randy Forbes, a Republican in Virginia. He sort of started this group in the Capitol, room 219. They used to get together and pray before going into the floor, and they would share their religious beliefs and take that with them when they were going to vote for these. And there's really nothing wrong with that, but I think that when we think that there's a separation of church and state, well, when you go to the Capitol, you walk past the rotunda, the U.S. Capitol, past the rotunda, right outside the door of the Speaker's house is a room. It's the prayer room. There's a room where the lawmakers go and pray and have services inside of the Capitol. When they didn't want to talk to me for this story, I waited till Ash Wednesday, and I knew where they were all going to be. And also, you could identify them really quickly as they were walking down the hall, right? So even if we chased them down the hall on that day, we still didn't get a lot of comments from them. But yeah, that was a fun day. But what was really interesting was, the smaller groups, the ones that are doing the influence at the state level. There's a lot of pro-family groups that call themselves, and we traced it back, not really traced it back, but just, wall builders. It says it right there, pro-family. You look for pro-family groups, they're in every state. And Wall Builders was started by a man called David Barton out of Aledo, Texas, and he's got a podcast called Wall Builders. Used to be former chair of the Republican Party here in Texas, and he is a conservative Christian who believes that the country was funded in Christian values, and believes that the founding fathers were that they went to seminary schools, and that's things that they take different lawmakers on tours, and also different pastors from different churches every year. And we were able to sit there and watch them one day, and they were rewriting history and walking around the rotunda, showing the same photos that we learned about in school, but from their Christian nationalist perspective, and the level of misinformation that is being spread by them is scary. You listen to that podcast, any episode, just pick any of them, and you will hear that they're pushing an agenda, and they're fighting a war, and the Project Blitz was a way of combating that. They believe that the country's been stolen from them, and they say it. They're not hiding it. They're saying we need to put more lawmakers that have our beliefs so that they could push these bills through the legislature, because the U.S. should be a Christian country, and it leads to discrimination, right? That's what that leads to. So we found probably the story with the highest outrage factor, right? We debated about which one of these bills should we focus on, and we were looking at maybe some ways, what stories were trending or whatever, but I think at the end of the day, we wanted the highest outrage factor. We found adoption bills there were state-sponsored foster care homes, and they were, they're getting state and federal money, but there's a bill in here that passed in, I think, 13, when we got it was at in 9 different states, and it allowed for, let's say, like a Protestant foster home that was, if a Catholic family came trying to adopt a child, they could legally say no because you're Catholic. And they weren't, I mean, it was they were protected by the laws. And
LGBTQ as well, right?
Yeah, so it was a way of also weeding out people that were same-sex, and they were discriminating about anyone who wasn't Protestant. And in other states, it was Catholic foster homes or just Christian foster, mostly Christian foster homes, and I think that's why it related directly to this, and we could link it directly to this because the language was in the book, but also the principles of those organizations were in line with what they were pushing. So, as a local reporter, I hate it when a national reporter came and just parachuted in and then wrote the story I wrote, but then obviously they had more resources, so they did a better job, right? And I hated that. I worked in South Texas. I covered immigration. That happened to me on a weekly basis. So instead of doing that, we just called the reporters that were covering this and told them, this is what we found. We got a playbook. This is where it came from, and this is the data to back that up. So I was like, I just basically need you guys to give me some color, and talk to some of your local reps and ask them if they were using the book and if they know about these special interest groups behind the laws that they're pushing. So we worked with 2 local reporters. We put out a story, and right after that, they pulled the book off. But I'm sharing a copy with y'all. It's on this slide, so you guys can have it. We did that. It was fun. It helped us really shape the machine because we had a guidebook, and we were basically copying what they were doing, but trying to reverse engineer it, right? So how do we find it? And so then I want to share. If you want to go to the next slide, some pointers on. It's not easy. It's not going to be this easy with all the other bills, right? It's not going to be a playbook that you guys could just download and then it has the names of the groups in the front. So I want to kind of share some tips on how to find this. We did this. I mean, at CPI, I was part of the states team, and that's what we did. We try to find who's pulling the strings, right? Who's calling the shots, and there's a couple ways you can find this, who's behind these bills without it being, just handed to you. So the first way I think that really helps is trying to triangulate by using states that have good data that can help you find similar players or issues in your state. So for example, Iowa, you can search for all the positions taken on bills by client or lobbyist. And then in Wisconsin, you can search the bill or topic or budget or subject. In Massachusetts, you can search for lobbyists and positions by bill number or description. And in Colorado, you can search for lobbyist positions also by bill number. In California, it has a list of lobbyist positions. In lobbyist filings and in bill analysis. So you do find a bill, you see it in any of these states, or in multiple of these states, you can start linking, okay, these are the same groups that are supporting or against these bills. And you could start trying to make a list of which of these groups are behind the model ledge. Another way, obviously, is like looking at what these lobbyists are doing, right? If they're taking them, look at their disclosures, and if they're taking them to dinners. In Iowa, these are, you can search for expenditure filings. They're called function reports in Iowa. And in Maryland, they're called event reports. So you can look at those reports and find out, right before they introduced this bill, they took them out and, got them a nice dinner or took them on a trip to a conference or something like that. In these two states, you actually have access to those. And then, search for the testimony. Legislative testimony is like clear, right? It just they're talking on the record about. But you guys are state house reporters. It's really hard sometimes to figure out if it's a 4-hour long video. When did they start talking about the bill that I'm looking for, right? So you look in other states where it's easier to find that. And Nevada allows you to search legislative committee minutes. I think their state system's called Nellis, and that you go through Nellis and you can search for keywords and find testimony. So you use the same keywords you're using to find these bills. A lot of the times their talking points are going to be very similar to what's in the bill. So you use that to kind of find out. In Maine, you have a website that also kind of has transcripts of a lot of this that you can search. Illinois, you can find positions and testimonies for committee hearings on their website as well. So also, the industry and advocacy groups, right? So they hold a lot of conferences, a lot of times they'll invite people to speak or they're part of the guest list. So a lot of times the guest lists are public. They have them on their site. So also search for that. Those online materials, guest lists, the state officials that have attended. Good ones, the Republican Attorney General's Association conferences, the Democratic Governors Association, National Association of Insurance Commissioners. Obviously, ALEC meetings we mentioned, and so you want to find out how they're courting these officials, right? So that's another way. The link at the bottom has it has some links to all of these, and it also has a lot of other cool tip sheets on finding lobbyists and lobbying reports that we used to use at the states team before that was dissolved at CPI. So it's basically our tool book that we used when we were reporting. So I'm sharing that with y'all. I don't think other reporters have that. And I didn't really ask if we could. I'm just doing it because I have a copy of it. And I think you guys need that. And let me talk about the last story I did. In the next slide, please. So it was about puppies, phones, and porn. Yeah, that's how we talk. That was the Capstone story for this project. Yeah, they let me come up with the idea, so that's what happened. They gave me freedom to do it at that point. And we had it was different though. With the other story, I literally had to go manually through 500 bills and highlight texts that were similar, doing Control F searches basically on PDFs or on Document Cloud, looking for ways to match that and manually check it. By this time, we had the tracker, and the tool was looking at 1.2 million bills across all 50 states and then comparing their text to each other, every bill to every other bill. Is the way he's going to explain it better than that. He's going to tell you how it works. But it also kind of, at least to me, the way that it worked was it would make the most copied bills just rise to the top. And it's a tool you can go to every week if you want to and see which are the most copied bills. So then We worked with engagement, and then we were like, all right, well, what bills do you think would be cool to focus on, right? We wanted to kind of show why everyone should care that model legislation exists, not just state house reporters or people that are into state policy. Like, how does it affect everybody, right? And that's sort of what we did. We picked the bills that had to do with consumerism and consumers, and how does this affect the everyday person, right? So we, using, I think, that logic, we wrote this story in a couple of weeks. I mean, it was like maybe 2 weeks. I mean, in comparison to the other story, it took us like 3-4 months, and that was because this tool is available, and we could see these bills clear. And I think it was the first time that we got to see that, and unfortunately, it was also the last time that we used it. I think we wrapped up the project by launching this tool, and we wanted to get as many eyes on it, and that's why we chose these stories, because they had sort of the most clickbaity names, and search engine optimization was like loving this, yeah, and we got a lot of eyes on it, but we wanted y'all to be using this, and the states team that was working on it was gone by then, so we were all working on other projects, and it was easy to find. I think these bills, they were pretty clear. I mean, they also posted. You see, this is just a copy of the latest model
Kristian,
bill.
You wanna walk them through what the 3 bills were?
Okay. Yeah. So the bills. Sorry.
I wonder if maybe we should go to Preethak or open it up to questions and then maybe go back.
Yeah.
Would that work?
Yeah, I think we could go.
How are we doing on time?
Yeah. So.
So we have till 2:30.
There's one cool bill that if you guys have a chance to follow, this is really cool because it's like model ledge against model ledge. So we got the the puppy mill bills, and they're both sides are using model legislation to like go at each other. So that one was fun. I thought it was cool. But yeah, I mean, Repair Association, ALEC, beef, milk industry. These bills are really easy to kind of pinpoint the special interest groups behind them and find the model legislation. So if you guys see those in your states, you could turn this around in a day if you needed to. It's very clear. They're also very willing to talk to everybody. So yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Preethak. You want to talk a little bit about the tracker?
And do you want to do questions right now?
Yeah. Any questions so far for any of the 3?
Hi, I have a question. I'm reporting in a very liberal blue state where Democrats control everything. Is there a Democratic equivalent to ALEC or a progressive equivalent to ALEC? Would it be the labor unions, or who would be pushing the model legislation on the left?
I don't know if there's a clear group that we've identified, largely because, like Kristian was saying, some of the stuff isn't as blatantly public, right? So the tool can tell you these 5 bills are similar across X number of states, but the real work is trying to find out lobbying records, sponsorships. So I don't think that I know of like one group specifically that. Obviously, there's like the right to repair folks where you can clearly say. But that bill's kind of nonpartisan, right? It's like a lot of farmers are pushing for right to repair. So we have a lot of like issue-specific ones. Mm-hmm. I don't think we've found like an ALEC per se. And I wonder if it's just because Democrats aren't as organized as the others are.
Yeah, there's something called the State Innovation Exchange.
Oh, that's right, SIX, yeah.
And then there's a group called ALICE. Those are 2 liberal group organizations that press bills. But like I said when I was talking, like the left has been far less effective at using this than the right. But yeah, they are out there for sure.
So this is what the tool looks like, and we'll do a demo pretty soon. Do you want to go to the next slide? Because I think that's sort of the. So I just want to give like a little background for the tool itself and how it works. I'm trying not to get into like too much of the technical details because I could talk to you guys for hours. I think the big source of this, and I think this project would not be possible without Legiscan. It's a great resource. It's a really good resource. All of you guys should use it. And so what we start with is, I think Legiscan, the earlier coverage pre-2010 is kind of varies by state, but generally speaking, I think after 2010 you have pretty much every state, every bill, every version in Legiscan. And so we pull the metadata, right? So who's the sponsor, what's the link to the state legislature's website where the text is available, and so we get those, right? Which obviously is surprisingly hard. I'm sure you guys can all share stories about how bad your websites are at the state legislature. And so I think about 8 months of the work was just getting the text, was just hitting every state. And some of these states, when you're looking at a bill that's in 2010, they've gone through like 4 redesigns at that point, right? And you're trying to like get it later. And a big challenge is like PDFs, because I learned this during this project. PDFs don't have the concept of strike through. Like there's no thing that says strike through a text. It really just draws a line on top of the text. And so obviously if you're trying to track amendments, it's a real problem. So we get all the text, and it's updated semi-regularly depending on how many deadlines I have. But generally speaking, weekly is our goal, is what we're trying to do. So basically every week we pull in all the bills from the last week, we run it through the tracker, and then we update the system. So ideally, in an ideal world, you should be able to go every week and see different matches if there are any. I think the process is called pairwise comparison, which is sort of what Kristian was describing earlier, right? So if you have 10 bills, that's, I don't know, I'm bad at high school math, but it's called like CN2, right? How many different ways you can choose 2 items from a set of 10 items. And so in this case, I think it's 2.3 million documents, right? Because we're doing all versions. If a bill has 4 versions, amendments and everything, we'll do every single one of them because we want to be able to track when it came in versus what happened to it, right? So 2.3 million documents across 1.4 million bills, which is very surprising to me. I didn't know that legislatures were that productive. I think Legiscan says that this last 2 years, there were 200,000 bills in legislatures, which was just, I thought my numbers were wrong. We were going back and forth about it. I was like, there's no way there's 1.4 million. But yeah, there's 1.4 million bills. And this is kind of the crazy part, right? Is that if you do like a brute force, take A, take B, compare A to B, you're talking about 2.6 trillion comparisons, right? Because you're thinking, again, it's about, you have to compare every bill, every version to every other version, right? So obviously that's a lot of work. It's a lot of money. And so there's obviously some optimization strategies that we have, which I can go through in a little bit later. But then the next step really is you want to build what's called community detection, right? It comes from graph design, social network analysis. Basically, the idea is you want to find the bills that are most similar to each other. Because a lot of the times there's a lot of like non-great matches. Like every single bill that talks about opioids will define opioids, right? And so the language is identical, but that's not substantive. And so, and the last thing that I think the tracker really does, which I think is more crucial for you guys, is that once it says these 5 bills are matches, you can select all of them, click highlight, and you can just go between the 2, right? You can say, highlight all of the similar language between this bill, and you can go through it. Because like I said, if it's like a case like the opioid bills, you want to be able to look at every single bill that you mention in your story, because you want to make sure that the language is substantive and relevant to the topic of the bill. Do you know the next slide? Thank you. So I just talked a little bit. I just want to quickly run through it. So this is basically like a broad overview of what we generally do. I think it's important that folks like kind of get a sense for it. So when you see something break or you see something weird, like you have a sense for like why it's weird. Can we go to the next slide? So this is generally what pairwise comparison looks like, right? You compare every bill to every other bill, and then you get like a similarity score. You say, like obviously in this case it's comparing cities, but the greener it is, the more match there is, right? But you get a sense for the scale of what this looks like, right? So now take this matrix and add 2.9 million rows and columns, right? And that's sort of what you're trying to do here. And so we use a process called Shingling, because every legislature has its own way of like defining things and like writing stuff. And obviously like legislation text is bad. Line numbers are horrible. Like I don't know why they have line numbers in public versions. I get why, but it makes text extraction really hard, right? There's a lot of like footnotes, just hard to do. So what we use a process called Shingling. where like this is one sentence, right? And so you just take a window of 3 words, then keep moving that window, right? So when we compare, it helps you find better matches, right? And so instead of comparing like word for word, we'll compare like 5-word windows and move them over, which gives you better matches, and really it's faster. When you think about the scale, right? So anything you can do to optimize, it's a lot better. And so when I talk about 2.6 trillion, we don't actually do 2.6 trillion comparisons, right? We take these shingles, as they're called, and say, do any of these documents have at least one shingle in common, right? And then we do that, right? So you eliminate a huge part of that 2.6 trillion matches. And the thing about the 2.6 trillion that's kind of crazy is that you have to rerun the process every week. Because when you introduce a set of like 10 bills, you have to compare it both ways, right? So every weekend we like redo this process. Next slide. And so the next process is identifying clusters and weeding out bad matches, right? So this is actually the process that took the longest. I think it was, many, many months. I guess text was longer, but so when Kristian was talking about the Project Blitz and using that as a ground truth for like building your model for how do you actually say that these bills are similar to each other and they're actually all related to each other, like every edge matches, right? It isn't that a bill talks about 5 different topics and then one of those is overlapping, and you want to make sure that when you say something is similar that you're actually sure about it. So and this, for example, and I can demo it later, is a critical race theory bill, which is I didn't realize, but it was like in 23 states as of last week. Identical language, they call it like teaching of divisive topics or something like that. And so this is an example of what the raw data, that's the raw data, right? That's the raw set of matches. You want to go from there to this one, right? I mean, you want to, those are like, thousands of them. Some parts match, some parts don't match. And so a huge part is that we have a model that does the comparisons and sort of eliminates community detection, right? So it's kind of just like if A matches B and B matches C, but A doesn't match C, you can't necessarily say that they're similar necessarily. And so anyway, that's can we go to the next slide? And so this is sort of, generally, I'm going to go through like 2 different types of stories, and it's like story recipes for like how you guys might be able to use the tool. And I think this is sort of helps highlight like the difference in approach between what Michael's team was doing at the Republic and what we were doing differently. So Michael's team was focused on the top 3, right? And the other groups, right? They went out and collected model legislation that people know about, and then they were like, okay, let's go find how prevalent this model legislation is across all the states. What we're trying to do is more internal, right? We're trying to say, let's compare every legislature to every other legislature and see if there's similarities, right? So their thing is sort of trying to track sort of the ones we know are nefarious. Let's go find how influential they are. And our focus was let's surface the ones that no one knows about, right? So I think it really worked out really well in that we found out that both are working on it, and it was a great partnership because we were able to attack it from like both sides and how we do it. And the workflow I outlined is very similar, I think, to what Michael's team was doing. And so I think this is sort of if you were to use, let's say a legislative aide reaches out to you guys and says, here's a bill that my rep is sponsoring, and you suspect it's model legislation. Find some keywords, something that is kind of specific, put it in the tracker. All you need is one bill, right? All you need to do is find one bill that has that language, and the tool will give you every other state, every time in your own state that a bill has been passed, right? I think for the critical race theory bill, or the fetal heartbeat bill, we found that they were introducing in Texas going back like 2016, every year introduction. It didn't make it anywhere until I think very recently, and I suspect it may have something to do with the Supreme Court. And so, you can, once you have the bill though, and I think this is where the hard part comes, right? The tool can tell you these are matches, but it can't tell you who sponsored it, right? Like that's sort of where the real work is, right? So it gives you a lead, but then you could use Legiscan to pull the sponsors, identify campaign contributions, because one of my favorite things about Legiscan is that if you pull the metadata, which you can just download for your state, they have the NIMP ID, so you could sort of take that ID, put it into Follow the Money, and it'll give you all of the contributions for each individual representative. And so that's super helpful when you're trying to go from bill to sponsor to who's funding them. And we're working on some tools to automate some of that, but it's TBD right now. I'll go to the next slide, please. And so that was sort of like how do you off session, right? Off session, how do you repo? So this is sort of, again, I'm not a State House reporter, spent the last few years doing voting rights, so again, I know nothing about how State House reporting works. This is based on my understanding of how State House reporters work, right? So correct, this could be completely useless to you guys, I don't know. But sort of, I think a few of the use cases that we found is the recency. So the first thing in the tool, which we'll demo later, is that you can click on recent, go to your state, and pick the number of days, and it'll say, here are the most substantive legislation that we found in your state that has copies in other states, right? So if every week, just go to that, 7 days, and then see what's there. The other thing is, if you have a specific bill that you're concerned about, you can just go into the search, put in the bill number for your state, or look for keywords, and it'll tell you here's every time that this bill has passed. The thing that I like about it too, and we were talking about like how do you brand this, right? And I think we were talking about this a while back too, is to me, like this is a model legislation tracker, but really it's like a legislative analysis tracker, right? So a lot of value is in what's going on within your own state, right? Like the history of this specific language going back 10 years, right? Is it a representative who was trying and trying and trying every year and it finally made it further than it is, right? And every year you can track how far it got. And one of my favorite things, and things I don't like the most, is budget bills, because they're really long, which breaks my tracker all the time because it runs out of memory because they're so huge. But the thing that I find interesting though is the number of bills that failed but have similarities to a budget bill, because they just sneak them in, right? And so budget bills are worth looking at. They introduce a lot of noise, right? So you have to spend some time going through the matches. But those are sort of one of my favorite ones, is because it feels like they're trying to sneak them in. I don't know if they are, but
they are.
right, yeah. Like I said, I'm not a State House reporter, so this is just my understanding of how you guys work. So I think those are some story ideas for when your legislators in legislation is in session, how the tool could sort of help. I think generally speaking, even off year, State House or not, I think it's a good sort of stop, right, in your story sort of process. Maybe when you're finalizing it, or maybe you're pitching it, just sort of put in the name of the legislator you're profiling, right? Just sort of as low stakes, just put it in the search, see what's out there, right? Worst case, you don't find anything and just move on. It's 10 minutes of your time. And so I think it's a good way to sort of add context. Those are really great tips and starting points. I want to make sure that we can get to questions for folks. Andy, I know you're going to raise your hand. Does anyone other than Andy have a question?
Are you going to go through how to use the tool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to do a demo. Yeah. And so I was thinking, I just have, I think, one more slide, and then we can just do a demo and then have questions while the demo is going on.
Great.
So this is the most important slide, I think. Caveats, there's not all model legislation is bad, and we'll see when the tracker comes up. And I think Michael talked about it a little bit, right? One of the most common piece of model legislation that we find is the National Interstate Nurse Licensure Compact, basically allowing nurses who are licensed in one state to go work in another state. There's so many of these, right? Like insurance regulations, like arbitration. Obviously, to me, it looks benign, right? But I don't cover these topics, right? So the interstate, home insurance standardization process may have some sneaky things that the National Association of Realtors wants. We don't know, I don't know, but a lot of bills are non-nefarious, right? Stuff another big one is disclosure laws for Amazon and online retailers on who's actually supplying the product. Stuff like that, which is, I'd say, pro-consumer and is generally appearing across the state. Like I talked about with the opioid bills, identical language doesn't necessarily mean model legislation. And I think any workflow, anytime you want to say, this bill has 5 copies across 10 states, pull up those 5 copies across 10 states. The tool makes it really easy. You just select all of them and hit highlight. It would take you 20 minutes to click through them and say, all right, does the highlighted language, is it actually substantive to the story you're covering? And I think that's, you can go to the next slide, but I think that's it. Yep, it's demo time. So we just have questions. I could just pull up the thing, but in the meantime, yeah.
Blaze Gainey with WPLN Nashville Public Radio, and I was wondering, is there anything this year that sticks out to you as going across multiple states? I know you talked about, I believe, the teacher curriculum. Is there other like similar to that, like book ban?
Yeah, I think the biggest one I saw was, I don't know, just this year seems like a lot of culture war stuff is there. Critical race theory is there. Sort of like conversion stuff is there. So I think the biggest one I saw is critical race theory. Like that bill, identical, because it's not a long bill, right? That's sort of been showing up, I think, in 23 states this year. This year alone, in 23 states. Different titles, but same identical language in a lot of them.
And then also, what about like anti-LGBTQ bills? Mm-hmm. Definitely related to sports.
I think, I saw one, I think in Texas actually. It's I can't remember the language, but it's basically like your biological gender has to relate to the sport you're playing. Like they're kind of just like, if you're biologically or you're born. So I think that's one that I saw in Texas, which was recent, I think in the last 30, 40 days maybe that was introduced. But that comes up every year too. So like I said, a lot of this stuff just comes up and fails a lot of the time. And one thing we're trying to add in, which in hindsight we should have, is filtering to just ones that have passed. But we're working on that. So here's the critical race theory one, right? There's a bunch of them, so it doesn't matter. You can pick the New Jersey version and go, or you can pick New York's version. They're all the same. You'll see all the matches in all of them anyway. And so let's go with the Missouri and Tennessee versions. You go highlight. Takes a second to think through this. And so you can just, here you go. Right, you can sort of say that it's identical, right? These are two different states, different pieces of legislation, identical. And so this is the big one that has come up recently. And it's funny because I think we were talking about, I was mentioning to Anne, is I feel like it's harder in the last few years to identify like the auto dealer type ones because there's so much noise. There's just so much noise right now in terms of model bills. So this is, by the way, just want to quickly point out, this is the one that I was talking about earlier, about the biological sex requirement for athletic competitions. And I think it's in 10 states. This is in Texas, and I think this was introduced October 25th, so current session,
So it was the first story that we did for the project.
Right, yeah.
And
I'm sorry,
because of the outrage factor, right? People were dying because the cars had been recalled and they were still being sold, and nobody was being held accountable because a model bill that had passed allowed them to do that. So outrage factor high. First story we launched, the project. I think it was in like June or earlier. We went to
April 4th?
Yeah, so
April 2019.
We kept reporting till November, I think. This is the last story of this. So it was a huge team. We had Arizona Republic people, we had USA Today, and then we had a whole team at the Center for Public Integrity. So it was 6 reporters, I think, working on that. So we all wrote multiple stories about a bunch of different things, but we all felt this was the most nefarious one that we
it's like most direct harm, right? Like immediate and direct harm.
Mm-hmm. Like it's not hard to explain why this is bad.
So I mean, I don't know if you get a chance. It's basically talked about earlier. It's auto dealers can sell used cars with active recalls without disclosing that there's a recall. So I think in Ruiz, one of the leads is a story about Takata airbags and that whole issue with airbags.
Yeah. Has anyone used Legiscan? Yeah.
Oh man, it's wonderful. Everyone should do it. I mean, honestly, like
it's free.
First
of all, yeah.
Right? It's absolutely free, unless you want some advanced stuff. In which case, not expensive. It's not too bad. If you, the paid offerings are, I think, more for legislatures, lobbyists. Like that's the vibe I get. I mean, as a data journalist coming from India, which is a very non-federal system, it's the bane of my existence. We did a voting rights project last year. We had to go to like 3,000 counties to get the data. Legiscan's great because it's standardized in one format, right? Anyway, Legiscan's great. You can also download the data sets. So you can just download a CSV of all the bills in your state. It also has text search. It's wonderful.
Yeah, the text search is you use 2-3 words for it to be accurate. If you go too big, it's not. It doesn't work as well. And then you could do research. It'll show you past bills as well.
Right.
It's a quick hit. I use it all the time when I write stories.
And the thing is, again, the tool would not be possible without Legiscan. That's just a fact. And I think everywhere in the tracker, you will always find Legiscan links. And one of my go-tos when I see a bill that I don't really understand too much is I pull it up, and one of my favorite things is they put like a spectrum indicator, so you know if it's bipartisan, if it's a Republican bill. So it makes it a little easier to again, I'm not a State House reporter, right? So I don't understand the process that well. But as someone who doesn't know, I find that really useful.
Yep.
Is to immediately get a sense for what's this bill.
And if you scroll down, you also see similar bills in the same legislature.
Yeah.
So if they originally introduced something and then changed it, or it's something that's been introduced in the House, and it'll give you the links there.
Right. But the thing is, I don't think this is language driven, unfortunately, and so it's trying to track bill reintroduction. Yeah. So it's a slightly different approach. Yeah.
Mine was just a pretty kind of technical question, but I know that in Minnesota, some bills will get fiscal notes or will get sort of research summaries, which are really helpful because they're written in plain English and sort of state what the bill would actually do. I know in California, they'll even say which groups oppose or oppose it, but does Legiscan include any of that sort of state-specific supplemental information?
Yes and no. So we have it in our tracker because we just pull it. So what we do is we use the Legiscan metadata to find the link to the state, and then we go to the state to get it. And so usually for me is I click on the link here, pull up the legislature's version, and then go from there. Mm-hmm. It varies by state, and I think it's because again, like I said, states' websites are really hard to work with, and so and they're building scrapers, right? And so they're victim to the same problems that you'd see anyone trying to scrape legislatures. Fiscal note specifically, I've seen it in some states. It shows up here. Sometimes it doesn't. So usually your best bet is to use this to find it and then click on that link. And they also have links directly to the text as well. And so amendments too. Again, coverage varies by year. Because again, they're working off of what the state makes available, and the state is kind of all over the place in terms of what to make available. So you guys have any questions for Michael?
I have Joe Bustos with the state newspaper. Quick follow-up on Legiscan. How often are they updated?
I think
it takes a couple of days from introduction.
Yeah, some are faster. I think if you pay, you'll get a lot faster. It's not a lot. It's not expensive to pay for it, but yeah, especially if it's one state. And so a lot of folks use it for you can set alerts that says anytime a bill with so-and-so info pops up, just send me an email. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
But I think we do weekly dumps, and so I know for a fact, but by the end of the week, it's there.
How you trace the model legislation back to the original group. I know you said that was one of the harder parts of the processes, but what processes did you use to do that, and also looking at how lobbying groups are getting involved in the sort of financial side of that.
Yeah, so looking at, I think the first is testimony. Whoever's openly talking about these bills a lot of the times. Honestly, the best tool is asking the lawmaker, right? You just call them and you tell them, hey, where'd this bill originate, and then they'll sometimes give you their talking points, but then just directly ask them. There was a special interest group that was involved in drafting a copy of this bill because that's what you're looking for. And I found it working for State Line that when you ask them a direct question like that, they'll say they'll get back to you because it's usually someone in their legislative staff that was handed that bill or has had communications directly with them. So I think that's the best bet, easiest way. I start usually that way. Then looking at testimonies, whoever's, whenever these bills are in committee, who's going there and talking. And the states that you'll see in the links from the slideshow, that those are the easiest ones to, go back and search through transcripts or actually be able to just scroll on the videos to the bills, so you don't have to watch 4 hours of whatever. And then linking lobbyists and campaign contributions, it gets tricky. Timing has a lot to do with it, right? When were these campaign contributions given? What side were these lobbyists on? It's harder to pinpoint things to a lobbyist, but once you get the information on who the lobbyist is, there's lobbyists that are specific to certain topics. It's good to have those contacts and have somebody on the inside that can tell you, hey, I'm pretty sure these guys were the ones that were. I'd say you got to make sources within the lobbyist groups. A lot of them want to talk or want to talk bad about another. Find lobbyist groups on both sides, and then just I guess put them against each other, right? Tell them you're writing a story about this. You want to know who introduced this bill, and they're opposed to it. They probably already know.
I mean, I'm sure they're proud of it, right? Like it's a success. Like they successfully lobbied. Yeah. And so in some ways, it's marketing for them. So.
Yeah, and I mean, you guys are there, so follow them.
Yeah.
It's part of it, right? You have to do it sometimes in person because they don't want to leave a paper trail. They'll give you information on background on things that you can talk to them, over a beer or walking towards a restaurant or something. I think it's helpful to stalk them. Yeah, go reporter on them.
I would say one thing is the site's down right now because Follow the Money is like merging with Open Secrets, and so it's a little bit of flux. But Legiscan has links, so if you see a sponsor, just click on the bill, go to sponsors, and you can just directly go straight to who's funding them or who's giving money to them.
Are you guys seeing any impact from lawmakers responding to it, either trying not to copy bills word for word or be clever about how they propose legislation?
Preethak talked about it a little bit, and then the budget bills are hard to track. I think I found one of the 500 that were copy pasted from Project Blitz. I'm sure there's more, but I only found one in a budget bill. I'm sure there were more. I did not want to spend the time to do that manually, so I didn't really get into that. And then,
so I mean, they do it. They see South Carolina's compelling state interest. The state has a compelling state interest, so they're doing some creative copying. This is the fetal heartbeat bill that Texas recently passed, the one that lets you sue or citizens sue, I think. I will say, like a little sales pitch, CPI, I mean, like Kristian talked about earlier, like we're not in the business of like swooping in and helicopter reporting and leaving. Our whole organization is designed around partnerships, right from the start, right? And so stuff like this, right, is every story that we do, we try to figure out how you can localize it and then like training folks to do it, right? And so we view ourselves to a huge extent, other reporters are one of our core audience. And so feel free to reach out to us. Any story any project you're working on, if you have a bill that you're not sure about, or anything, we're always happy to help. And that's a core part of our mission. So.
All right, if he gets to plug, I'm gonna have to plug State Line. State Line with Pew. Basically, Pew's got a bunch of money they give us to just, track state trends, and They pay for all the subscriptions to all the local papers, and so we have access to stories. And every day we got reporters all across the U.S. and we look for state policy trends, and we publish a newsletter that shows you, what's happening. And I think that's the best way to find trends. The State House, through State House reporters, follow them on Twitter, create groups, and just look at what people are reporting across the states.
1206. Oh. This one?
Yeah.
So it does pull it up, right? So it's a different, it doesn't match necessarily the critical race theory bill, but it matches, like that language matches. I just want to see if it actually does. I think it's, yeah. So again, when I talked about shingling earlier, that's why shingling is so important, right? It manages some of the differences in language that we talk about, because it looks at subsets of each sentence.
Well, thank you so much. I have a feeling that everyone's going to be going to Legislate and your tool after this. Let's give them a hand.